Assim que a gente vê que a gente abre confusão. Faz sentido só.
Are we online? Yes. Okay, so good morning, everyone. It is with great pleasure that I open this session today. Not before apologizing for this little tardiness. We've experienced not only a few technological problems, but also some of the people who confirmed the presence, the physical presence, are in a different building, and so we're waiting for them to arrive. So thank you very much for being with us today. We are very happy to have Professor Alan de Winter with us today to talk about such an important topic, not only for internationalization in general, but also, and perhaps more importantly, for internationalization at home. And before I introduce Professor Alan de Winter, I'd like to say a few words about this project and why Professor Alan de Winter is here. Before the pandemic, about 3 years ago, we started working with the University of Coventry, specifically with Professor Marina Jones. And then UFIS started a collaboration with the University of Coventry through the CAMI Sprint project. We are very happy to have the collaboration between the two universities, and I'm very happy to have here with us today in person Professor Yuri Leite, the head of the International Office, also Professor Wagner Santos, the coordinator of the Postgraduate Program of Education, and Professor Tania De Boni, one of the professors of the PhD program in education, who has helped us to make this partnership possible. Also, we have Carlos Ildeblando, who is a PhD student in education, and we're very happy and very proud to say that very soon, hopefully in September, Carlos will be going to Coventry to finish his degree, his PhD degree in Coil, and he'll be working under the supervision of Professor Marina Jones and Professor Alan de Winter at Coventry University. And so we're very happy to see such big interest in the topic, and hopefully with Carlos' return, we'll have at least one specialist in Coil and virtual exchange at UFIS as well. And so without further ado, I'll give you a few notes that I've prepared about Professor Alan de Winter before calling him to present his talk here today. As I said, Professor Alan de Winter is here today at UFIS with the support of Fabis, a project of Fabis and the Newton Fund UK Academies project, and also with the support of the Program of Education and the International Office at UFIS. So we are very thankful for all for the support. Dr. Alan de Winter is an early career researcher in the Center for Global Learning at the University of Coventry in the United Kingdom, and his academic background is rooted in peace reconciliation. I couldn't say how important this is in the moment we're living in the world today, and I'm so happy that you're here to discuss possibilities to work with this. That was the focus of his PhD thesis of peace education. His particular interest in education follows different trends, especially diversity between learners, and how that can be harnessed to enhance the higher education experience. As such, much of his current research focuses on the internationalization of higher education, which aligns also with what we are doing in our research group at the Postgraduate Program of Education here. So I'm very happy for that as well. And how it can serve stakeholders through offering innovative and non-traditional educational methods, including technological, third space, and decolonized approaches, which is also what Carlos and some of my advisees and members of the research group are working with. Dr. Alan de Winter has a particular interest in the use of collaborative online international learning, also known as Coil, which is what he's going to present to you today. And we're very happy at UFIS, Alan, to say that we've been trying to work with this. Carlos and I, since 2018 or 19, have been trying to do this. We've been able to have 4 different Coil projects at UFIS, It's not much, but it's a start. And we hope that your presence here and the discussions you're going to allow is going to plant further seeds for us to work with that. Also, he's working across global south and north boundaries and has started to publish around these issues and how Coil can help in relation to equality and diversity. Also, other topics of interest. As our head of international office here, Professor Kudu, can attest, UFIS is known and has been putting a lot of effort into following the SDGs, the UNESCO Sustainable Development Goals, and so we are very happy to see this effort towards more equity, diversity, and inclusion. He's been working, Dr. Anna has been working in international projects and programs such as Javito, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, if not, please correct me later on, and the exploration of virtual learning in the Jordanian context. Kudu, a Coil capacity building project exploring Africanized, decolonized approaches in South Africa. Also in China, South Africa, and other places in the global south. And studying British transnational higher degrees with China, minorities on Indian campuses, and exploration into minority violence within the Indian higher education sector. The Winter is also keen to continue exploring how peace theory and peace education and practice might be able to apply, might be applied to positively influence the higher education landscape, and further exploring how digital technologies might be used in an education setting to promote conditions of positive peace and learning from diversity. So I hope that this introduction has shown you the relevance of Professor Alan de Winter's work and our aim here and our interest at UFIS and at the Postgraduate Program of Education to connect with these ideas on promoting more internationalization at home, internationalization of the curriculum through the use of Coil and other approaches. Thank you very much, and without further ado, I call Professor Alan de Winter, please.
Thank you ever so much for that, and thank you for the opportunity to present here. This is my first time in Brazil, and very welcoming and feel so it's very great to be here. So thank you. So yes, the presentation today is the potential of virtual exchange and collaborative online international learning for internationalization at home. So what I want to do today is a bit of a broad overview, and hopefully it's not too broad, but there'll be plenty of opportunities to ask Q&A. But yes, what I'd like to do is just discuss a little bit around what is internationalization at home and why we think it's important, a tiny little bit about what the literature says about the area, but then I want to look a little bit more about Coventry's journey, because the universities have quite a long and varied and interesting sort of journey with Coil in particular. And then, as mentioned by Kyria, some of the example projects we're looking at and how those are relevant and how we tailor virtual exchange and Coil to what we're doing. And then a little bit of sort of speculation, I guess, but based upon the literature about what does the future hold. So just a little bit about me. I've actually been working at Coventry University since 2006, and a lot of my working life has been very much based around international stuff. So my subject area, my undergraduate degree and my master's degree is around international relations and then peace and reconciliation studies. So a lot of my original area of research was very much around how people work together in the internationalized space, in the globalized space. My very first job, I worked very closely with international students in particular, working in administration, but then I started to move a little bit more into the academia behind these things. So I lectured in international relations for a little bit. I worked at quite an interesting centre called the Centre for Global Learning for a few years, which was kind of the administrative support for internationalisation and helping students be mobile and looking at internationalisation at home. More recently, I finished my PhD in 2018, and I then moved into the Centre for Global Learning, which is the research centre I'm currently based at, which is where I've had the opportunity to work with Kyria, working now with Carlos. So really, really exciting projects there, and it's really nice to be sort of truly global. So yes, I describe myself as having sort of a special interest primarily in human interaction. So how do people work together, particularly within higher education and particularly within this virtual space? A lot of this is looking at intercultural competencies, how people from different cultures communicate and work together. Again, internationalised learning, online learning, which is very much the focus of today, but also looking at sort of some more modern trends, certainly in the UK, around the decolonisation of higher education, equity within higher education, and this concept of sort of third space learning as well. And I just want to begin to say as well is that this is really sort of almost like a hotly contested topic when I talk to about virtual exchange and online international learning and all these things with colleagues overseas. People do have very, very different opinions and very strong opinions as well. So I just want to say that these are kind of my opinions and some of the observations I've made throughout my time working in this area. I do fully acknowledge that lots of people do have very, very different opinions, very strong opinions. I think of some of my American colleagues, such as John Rubin, who's very much the father of Coil. If some of the things that we describe as Coil at Coventry, he would not recognise as Coil at all. So there's some very interesting viewpoints there. And again, I'm just hoping to offer some insights. I can't say I'm the definitive sort of expert on it. I know little bits and have some experience, but there are a huge variety of viewpoints out there. So internationalisation at home is something we do have a very strong spotlight on at Coventry. And this is very much around the recognition that internationalisation is important to a student's identity and a student's teaching and learning. But this idea that everyone can travel all around the world, it's not really possible, particularly for the huge majority of students, even at Coventry, where we have had a spotlight on mobility. So a quotation here, internationalisation at home is a way of offering international and mobility to students. This may be through on-campus activities, maybe connections with local communities and organisations, and through sort of the international global connections through the internet, or any combination of these. And one thing that I like to say and sort of look at as well is that internationalisation at home is often a more inclusive, potentially a cheaper way of achieving internationalisation. And if you start to look towards more sort of the ecology and being eco-friendly as well, if we cut down the reliance on global travel and having everyone travel across the world in airplanes and whatnot, this is possibly sort of a greener way of doing things as well. That's potentially, I guess, controversial, because there is sort of an environmental cost of having computers running and having all these digital technologies running all the time. But there is sort of a growing field of research that perhaps suggests that the lessened reliance on travelling internationally is perhaps a better way of going about internationalisation at home. So virtual exchange then, one of the reasons that we do put a strong spotlight on virtual exchange is because it's harnessing internet technologies to bring students together. And as we'll come on to, we see virtual exchange as being very much this umbrella term of a lot of different groups of activities. So European Agency evolves as virtual exchange is a practice supported by research that consists of sustained technology-enabled people-to-people education programs or activities in which constructive communication and interaction takes place between individuals or groups who are geographically separated and or from different cultural backgrounds, with the support of educators and facilitators. Virtual exchange combines the impact of intercultural dialogue and the exchange of broad reach and digital technology. There's quite a lot to unpack there, but I think what's most important about virtual exchange is that it is using digital technologies, online technologies. But that isn't to say that students will just have free rein and go mad and do whatever they like online. It is structured education, it's still targeted, and it is important that this is supported by educators and facilitators. If we take away educators and facilitators out of that equation, we get very, very different types of learning. We have something called MOOCs, the massively online connected education that's students learning from sort of pre-uploaded elements online. That is a little bit of a different thing, but as I say, virtual exchange is very much around getting students to communicate together in structured, safe spaces that should have this sort of teaching and learning impact that should be for the benefit of the students and the teachers as well. I mean, there's a lot of teachers that get, a lot that educators can get out of operating in the virtual environment too. And here's some extra stuff that I've actually drawn from my colleague Marina, who works very closely with Kyria.
She's watching us.
Yes, oh, fantastic. So Marina might well recognise this slide. So yeah, virtual exchange is kind of, as I say, this umbrella sort of broad sort of spectrum of activities that happen. And there's a few sort of nuances, I guess, that can come of this as well. One of them that we are starting to look at Coventry a lot more, and it's a little bit sort of intangible and strange to explain, but this is the idea of third space learning. Third space learning is this idea that sort of we have formal education and we ask students to do tasks and come together in the classroom. But between that with the interactions and the communication and sort of the non-classroom based activities, there's this concept of third space learning that takes place. And it's a very strange thing to sort of research and a very strange thing to unpack, because there's not a lot of research out there that really gets into the sort of nuances of what do the students get through things like communication with other people from other cultures and people coming together. And again, there's something that we at Glee very much want to look at a little bit more. My manager Catherine and indeed Marina are looking at this in a little bit more detail. But as I say, it's unpacking what is the value of these communications and these interactions students get between sort of different cultures and different peoples that might not be in the classroom. And again, virtual exchange is a very, very interesting space for this to happen, because again, we can draw students from very distant geographic areas together in an online space, and actually just having students communicate and figure out how we're going to talk, how we're going to communicate with each other. That sort of in-between learning is very interesting, and that this concept of the third space, I think, goes hand in hand with virtual exchange. The other area that's, again, very close to my heart and what we do very much at Coventry University is this idea of decolonisation. And this is unpacking the concept that certainly in Europe, there's a lot of very Eurocentric practices, and certainly in the UK, we get very blinkered into teaching, well, this is what we do in the UK. This is education to study and work in the UK. But if we're operating in a truly globalised, internationalised space, that's not very helpful for the many, many students who aren't from the UK or have no interest in working in the UK post-study. So decolonised education is taking that viewpoint that perhaps what we do in the UK is just one very small viewpoint within knowledge, within teaching and learning, opening it up then to have a bigger platform for people to say, well, actually, this is how we learn from my country, or this is how we learn things in our culture. And that there's very, very strong evidence to show this is a much better way of doing things. One thing that always sticks to my mind is just before the pandemic, Australia had a lot of trouble with very, very severe bushfires and lots of devastation there. And one of the arguments there was actually if we'd listened to, if that system had listened to Australian sort of native and very sort of localised knowledge, there was a practice, I can't remember the name of it, but burning off the top leaves and in a controlled way to make sure bigger fires didn't happen. But because that practice was seen as sort of a fire danger, they moved away from that sort of practice, and then the end result was these massive wide-scale wildfires. And stuff like this is very interesting to me, that actually if we give people the correct platform and the correct spotlight to present their knowledges, their ways of doing things, and having that reciprocal and understanding space to really take in this plurality of ideas and this plurality of knowledges, again, I think the virtual exchange is a perfect platform for this, because it creates the space for people to talk and realise, well, actually, my way of doing things might not be the right way, and have those sort of very constructive arguments and insights from people from other cultures, other areas. The other thing that virtual exchange does quite well is you might have heard this term glocal, the global and the local, and it's bringing awareness of where local societies, local areas have a place in the international and vice versa. So again, Coventry is a very interesting sort of spotlight for this. Coventry has always been a very international university and a very outward-facing university, but only in the last few years we thought, well, hang on, we've got lots of local knowledge within Coventry as well. And Coventry is the city of peace and reconciliation in the UK. We had a very turbulent history during World War II, where the city itself was completely destroyed as part of that particular war. So when it was regenerating and developing itself, Coventry positioned itself as this city of peace, where people could come to the cathedral and come together. And again, this whole concept it really goes hand in hand with this idea of virtual exchange and this idea then of the global. How do we then link up this idea of Coventry being the city of reconciliation with some of the teaching and learning that we do at the university. And there's some really exciting things happening with working with local communities, working with the local refugee centre, for example. And again, we're trying to find more and more ways of bringing virtual exchange and Coil into what we do, bringing in local knowledge, local excellence, and how that then works with the international. One of the projects I worked on, we put a bid in just pre-pandemic, working with our local library, for example. Sadly, it wasn't successful, but this was trying to create a global reading group where we would have local volunteers who'd come to the library wanting to read books, and then we would go around our international volunteers to read books perhaps from very different authors and from perhaps different viewpoints. And we're very keen again to look at this and to foster this idea about what can virtual exchange do at all these different levels. So yes, for us as a university, it is looking at teaching and learning and helping our students. Also, there's so much more that virtual exchange can do. And again, it can bring in local non-governmental organisations and businesses. So there's quite a broad application of what virtual exchange can hold for internationalisation and internationalisation at home. And again, I believe there was one of these questions, so I might preemptively answer the question for later, but I very much see virtual exchange as being this idea of an umbrella. So in my mind, virtual exchange is a very broad term that we can use to infer or to refer to quite a lot of things. There's also sort of an argument there about what it can be called. And actually, Marina had a very interesting presentation to myself fairly recently about this international argument about should it be called virtual exchange, should it be called telecollaboration. But in my mind, I do see it as this umbrella. So we use virtual exchange perhaps interchangeably, and perhaps it's not a specific enough term. But within that, we have things like Coil, collaborative online international learning, even stuff like virtual guest learning, online conferences, online debates, bringing people together in sort of, as buddies or sort of working together in symposia. So it's quite a broad sort of spectrum, a broad church of what goes on. Within my area, I do very specifically look at collaborative online international learning and perhaps a little bit more focused teaching and learning in that way. That's one way of doing it. But if you speak to different people about what does virtual exchange mean to you, you probably find quite a lot of different answers there. And some would argue virtual exchange is a different entity itself to Coil. But I say, in my mind, I do see it as this umbrella of terms, and many, many more things kind of filter into that. And this brings me on to then what Coil means. So again, a lot of my research, a lot of my work experience is very much around collaborative online international learning. I do sort of make that sort of emphasis here that it's just one method of doing it. We've had a lot of success in Coil at Coventry. However, that's not the only way to do it. And many different universities and different people have varying different approaches to what virtual exchange is. And as we'll come on to, I think for me, the concept of virtual exchange is it's important to tailor it to your local your local way of working. For us, Coil works because it kind of matches the infrastructure that we've built at Coventry, and over the last sort of 10-20 years, Coil has formed a sort of one solution for us. But there are different ways of going about virtual exchange. And I've drawn here from John Rubin, who again is one of our, the father of Coil. I believe he coined the term Coil, but we worked with him on the Kudu project. So he explains that Coil is not a technology or platform, but rather, I guess, a tool, a new way of teaching and learning that develops cross-cultural awareness across multicultural learning environments. Unlike typical online distance courses provided by one higher education institution to students nearby around the world, Coil is based upon developing team-taught learning environments where teachers and teaching staff or educators come from two or more very different cultures to work together and to develop a shared syllabus, to develop experiential teaching and learning, and to collaborate. And again, this is kind of the joy for me about Coil is it's very collaborative. We do have lots of different partners from all around the world, and it's not just all about us in Coventry sort of saying we're going to do a Coil. It's shall we do a Coil? Can we come together? And there's no sort of one way about doing things. And this is where decolonization also sort of feeds in, because when you're working with partners from very geographically different areas, it does become a conversation, it does become sometimes a compromise, but you come together to figure out a mutual way of working, and this idea of sort of equality and equity then becomes a lot more real, because we are working in such cultural way. I mean, we always say just, it's never a good thing to say, well, we're going to do it the British way or we're going to do it the Coventry way, because that defeats the object of that collaboration. It has to be that conversation where people come together to achieve something mutually together. And again, it's a bit silly to point out, but each of the letters of COIL is so important. So the C is collaborative. Again, students have to come together to do something collaborative. If they're not collaborating, it then becomes something like a guest lecture. So usually you do have to set a task, and students have to work and learn to work together in the online space to achieve something. Sometimes that's as simple as learning about each other. It can be as complex as designing a prototype for a car or something electronic. It's quite scalable, and you need to know your audience, you need to know your students and teachers to figure out what's feasible. But the key critical component has to be they have to come together to collaborate. And again, it might go without saying, but it has to be online. If you bring students together in a classroom physically, it then kind of ceases to have that sort of that element. And again, I think the online then sort of leaks into the international. I think one of the greatest strengths of COIL is because it's so international and because it's online, we do reach out to more people and we can get more geographically distant students together. Again, Coventry, as we'll see, previously had a very strong emphasis and spotlight about sending our students physically around the world, which is fine, but we do lose some of that sort of, it is a very narrow way of internationalizing. And through COIL, you can bring so many different students together in an online space, and you can have so many more different types of interaction in that sort of virtual arena. And again, it seems so silly to point out each letter individually, but the L is learning. And again, students must be aware of and be sort of taught that this experience is a learning experience. After you do that COIL activity, you will come out with a new skill or having learned something new. And again, this is something that we really need to reinforce to our students. Sometimes when you get brand new students coming to us who have never heard of COIL or see COIL for the first time, their immediate reaction is, well, this isn't teaching, this isn't learning. We want a teacher at the front and we want to be taught in the classroom. But then afterwards, when they reflect on things, they do see the real benefit of doing it. And you see so many students who are very stubborn to begin with, going, we're not doing this, this isn't teaching. But after the experience, after maybe a year or two, you do see their mindsets change, and they come to us as academics and teachers and educators saying, oh, I really understand that now. So again, it is a learning curve for everyone involved, but as I say, it is such an enriching experience for anyone involved in it. And again, I'm such a huge proponent of virtual exchange in COIL, but we must recognise there are some caveats to operating in this virtual space, and something we do have to be very careful of in terms of, again, considering equity and fairness in delivering things in this online space. The first being costs. We often say that virtual exchange in COIL is an inexpensive way of going about internationalisation at home. But I suppose what we can't forget that this is relative. So it is cheaper relative to sending a group of students abroad. But access to technology, access to laptops, to the internet, can be quite expensive for different people. When I'll come on to some of our example projects later, we'll cover some of the nuances of costs there. But also training, I think as Kyria inferred earlier, we do need some sort of training and expertise in COIL, especially to be able to deliver it. And this is not something that is sort of easily just like snap of the fingers. It can be quite experiential, and this is perhaps why we see COIL to slowly take off sometimes, because it does require people sort of putting their foot in, just dipping their toes in, getting that experience and slowly sort of developing their skills to be able to impart their knowledge to others. And again, for Coventry, we did start off with a very, very small handful of academics leading in COIL. Again, my colleague Marina, she was very much at the vanguard of this, sort of one person doing these new and exciting experiences for students, and it was just one person in one department, and then through sort of sharing that and sharing the knowledge and sharing the training, it became much, much bigger. But again, as I say, it can take time, so it's not going to be, we're going to sit down and in one day you'll know what COIL is and everything and how to do it. It can be a long-term thing, and it might take a year or two to fully develop this sort of consciousness around COIL and how to do it. And again, I suppose one of the quirks of Coil is that there is no one way of doing it either. Because you can tailor it and because it's such a flexible tool, you can train people in the broad sort of concept of Coil, but sometimes it's people want to do their own things. So this concept of delivering Coil training is quite interesting, because all we can really do is guide people and say this is broadly what we can do, but they're still sort of learning to do in between the lines there as well. Equity of access, again, is a very tricky one globally, and again can tie into costs. And some of the projects that we've done within GLE, for example, it's been very eye-opening in terms of equity of access, because again, we do sometimes forget in the UK that access to the internet isn't always universal. And again, with one of my projects I'll highlight later, the students did have access to the internet, but certain times of the day were problematic, or certain times of the day were costly. And this is something that we do have to be very mindful of, and especially when we're tailoring and designing Coil, we have to really think about how equal is it for all partners. And another question that is always quite a difficult one, and something that I've still not got an answer about, is that because we do Coil from a UK institution, the default language tends to be English, and because lots of our students don't learn multiple languages within England, and again, me sat here in this presentation, I'm so sorry I can't talk to you in Brazilian or Portuguese, my language levels are in that area are quite low, but I think this demonstrates some of the trickiness of designing and delivering Coil, but also some of the tensions of decolonisation. So some of the questions we're asking ourselves is, how fair is it to always have to deliver Coil in English? Sometimes our overseas partners are very interested in wanting to do it in English, because it represents an opportunity for students to practice English. But then on our side, how fair is that to always expect partners to do that? And there are some interesting technological solutions to this. For example, Teams and Zoom have an auto-translate function now where you can talk in any language and it will translate it on the fly to English, which is great from one perspective, but from the other perspective, it's very challenging because you lose the cultural concepts there, and sometimes the translations don't fully capture the heart and soul of what people are saying. Because it's a direct translation of what someone's saying, you do lose the nuances of colloquialisms or local sort of sayings and whatnot, and actually the direct translation can be more confusing because you do lose that sort of context. And again, if we're using technology translation solutions, are we then lessening that intercultural collaboration? So again, that's always sort of a very tricky and a very challenging thing to grasp, certainly within that decolonisation lens. And again, no answer myself there to it, but very, very interested to do more research and look at sort of the role and the hindrances perhaps of English as the language there, particularly within Coil. So as I say, perhaps my definition of Coil is it's a tool. It's very much a flexible tool with much potential. But it very, very much needs to be tailored for each situation. So you probably find that if you look at Coventry University's Coil, no two Coils are identical because they have to be changed, they have to be tweaked depending on who that partner is. And very much that concept of local considerations and equality and equity of engagement must be considered. So again, yes, we must recognise these caveats, but it's working around those to make sure that everyone can fully engage and get the most out of it that they possibly can. So I'd like to talk a little bit here about Coventry's journey now, because it's very interesting to see how we've grown and how this sort of influences our thinking around Coil. I believe Kyria shared an article that was written by Coventry University academics, I think 5 or 6 years ago. It was written around a time when Coventry was just at the start of its journey around the whole institutional version of working in internationalisation at home. And for anyone who did read that article, or perhaps wants to read that article, one of the very quirky nuances of it is that we don't refer to Coil as Coil. At that time, referred to it as oil. We didn't have the C. And that was one of Coventry's attempts at sort of branding its own version of Coil. But as I say, in terms of the history of Coil, lots of our academics in pockets, like my colleague Marina again, started their journey in Coil as sort of, it was their initiative. They very much was, we were going to try something new, we're going to try it with our classrooms, and this was pushed at the grassroots level. So in the late 2000s, early 2010s, we started to see maybe 2 or 3 sort of academics who were like very interested in this concept of virtual exchange and Coil, and pushing it as an experimental type of teaching and learning. And it was a slow adoption rate. Not everyone was adopting it. People were a little bit hesitant to do it. There were people stamping their feet saying, no, this is not education, we shouldn't be doing this. So it was a very interesting time, because people, there were almost sort of 2 camps. There were people who were very much invested in wanting to do Coil and seeing it as a real opportunity and benefit for students. And some people who are sat there cross-armed saying, no, this isn't, how do we do this? And this was very much, I guess, around subject areas. And some of our more practical subject areas or more theoretical subject areas were perhaps the last ones to adopt this sort of approach. So in one of my job roles, one of the last areas that we had to sort of tackle or to break into was the healthcare teaching and learning, and also things like physics, where they were very practical, very sort of set, perhaps with national guidelines, like the nursing, for example, with our National Health Service guidelines. It was seen as a bit of a barrier there to say, well, how do we internationalise when we've got such a strict way of doing things? Or in the case of perhaps maths and physics, the argument was, well, mathematics is an international language, you know, it's already international, no version of it being maths. So they were quite interesting sort of barriers and challenges to break down around, well, actually, Coil can be useful, but perhaps in different ways. And eventually, this grassroots pushing to have more Coil, to have more virtual exchange, came to a head around in 2015, where we had a university-wide mission statement that specifically set out to have an internationalisation pillar. And this is where the language of internationalisation at home was very much embedded into sort of Coventry's fabric. At the time, there was very much a push to still have students mobile. We were obsessed with having students going abroad. But there was an awareness and inclusion there of internationalisation at home. And I was very fortunate, so I joined the Centre for Global Engagement as it opened in 2015. And this was a institutionally centralised office which dealt with support and for student and staff around internationalisation at home. And it was a huge office. We had 45 people working for it. And we did all sorts of things like Coil, helping with mobility, having students work on work experience. So overseas students coming to the UK could have work experience opportunities. We worked with the then Erasmus office, so we were looking at opportunities for students to study and swap places in Europe. So much going on. It was a very exciting hub. And this is where the Coil team was set up. So we had 4 or 5 people dedicated to supporting Coil and helping to train Coil across all the faculties, all the departments. My role was very specific in the Centre for Global Engagement. I was brought on to try and help internationalise research students. So I was tasked with trying to set up Coil for PhD students and international online symposia. But my colleagues were very much working in sort of departments, undergraduate level, postgraduate taught level, trying to make sure that everyone was everyone at least had the opportunity to engage in Coil. And again, the paper, if you read it, my 2 then colleagues, Daniel and Brynda, they wrote that paper whilst also sort of developing Coil within that department. So then it became, rather than this grassroots push up to do Coil, it almost swapped. We had this top-down mandate from the university, the senior management very much on board with Coil, with virtual learning. And the mandates from that mission statement, that sort of strategy was for all students to experience internationalisation, whether it be internationalisation at home or travelling through mobility. This then evolved over the next few years. So by 2017, all but one teaching department then had at least one Coil embedded into their teaching and learning. So it perhaps was one module out of a degree that would offer it. But what that meant was most students were then having the opportunity to do Coil across almost all the subject areas at Coventry. This then continued to expand, so just up until the pandemic, Coil was then offered to all our students. So we then set up mechanisms for all departments to be able to offer Coil, and if the department wasn't able to do it for any reason, we also had centralised Coil, which are focused on intercultural competencies and teaching and sharing, that were set sort of more outside of the departments, outside the teaching and learning, and were on offer to all students. So this meant over the years, so the number of students engaging in Coil exploded. It grew very rapidly. So here's some statistics. So from our very first record in 2015, we had around 3,000 students engaging in Coil across 89 projects, delivered in conjunction with 90 overseas students from 47 countries. So what that showed us in 2015, there was a lot of appetite from the rest of the world to engage with us in Coil. The reason we had 90 overseas students with 89 projects was sometimes we get multiple institutions on board for one project. So it isn't always just Coventry to UFES, for example. It might be Coventry to UFES with China or different mixes there. Then over the years, you can see these numbers expanding slowly. So 2018-19, we had about 500 more students engaged in it. 2019-20, slowly growing. And then, of course, the pandemic hit and our student numbers, our student teaching and learning had to go online. So you can see here a significant rise in students being involved because the pandemic opened up an opportunity to really sort of reinforce those numbers and to really preach the virtues of Coil. And we're still waiting for this current year's numbers, but we're expecting to see those numbers grow and grow and grow. We may well hit a plateau because obviously we've only got a certain number of student numbers at the university. But as you can see here, maybe in the space of 5 years, we're over doubled the number of students being involved in Coil, growing sort of organically to begin with, but then the pandemic by necessity made a lot of students sort of engage. And as you'll see as well with the numbers, they do fluctuate year on year. We don't always have the same partners every year. People change their minds. It's not always possible to run the same Coil each year. But it's an ongoing negotiation. We're always very reciprocal. If an institution comes to us to say, we're really interested in Coil, the centralised office will then say, fantastic, we'll put you in contact with the right people. And again, that office, the Centre of Global Engagement, was very much that one-stop shop. So if someone came to the university and said, tell us about Coil, can we do a Coil with you? They would then work on a professional administrative level to reach out to the academics to then try and link people together. And I'll just put this on here as well. This is a really interesting, slightly outdated concept. So our original sort of wheel, our original envisionment for internationalization at home was actually using Coil as a springboard to mobility. So again, we were very obsessed back in 2015 with this idea of, yes, we'll get students to internationalize at home and experience Coil over the course of years 1, 2. But then it was always seen as that gold standard to have students to travel. You'll see it's this old that it's still referring to as oil, not Coil. So this is a really interesting sort of our first sort of iteration of internationalization at home wasn't just internationalization at home. It was internationalization at home as a springboard to travel. And this to me was always slightly problematic because we can't always expect students to be globally mobile. It's not feasible. It's not cheap, it is expensive for students, it's not environmentally friendly. So I think what we've tried to do a little bit more over the years is to lessen that sort of emphasis on pure mobility and see internationalization at home as an equal, at least, to mobility. So as I say, over the sort of last certainly 5 years, 6, 7 years, our current practice is that we offer all of our students some form of virtual exchange, usually through the guise of Coil. Not always, but most of our students, if they're going to do virtual exchange at home, it'll be through Coil. We've then sort of shifted to this. Mobility is on offer, and the university is still quite proud of supporting our universities being globally mobile, but perhaps it's not so much of an expectation anymore. I think the value and virtue of virtual exchange in Coil is now seen as an equal, and by getting our students to engage virtually, that is seen as important. The other thing that perhaps a particularly UK thing, we're very obsessed with employability in the UK. So at the heart of our internationalisation at home agenda, we have this idea of skills and employability. So again, intercultural competencies are very, very important there because we want students to sort of learn to engage with other cultures, learn how to operate in a global environment, intercultural, international environment. So when we're operating things like Coil and mobility, very, very strong focus there on making the students are trained up in those skills. And as sort of an extension to that, this concept of global citizenship as well, when we're sort of working with our students, we're wanting to say, well, yes, you're doing this as a teaching and learning experience. However, in the real world, in the world of work, you need to know how to operate as a global citizen and to operate and work with students and people and colleagues from other cultures. Perhaps a newer thread is this concept of decolonised approaches. So again, when we're talking with our students and we're training our students and doing Coil with our students, what we're trying to instill in them now is you've been perhaps taught in a certain way from, especially for UK students, from a UK perspective, but use Coil as a learning opportunity to gain insight into other cultures and other sort of other decolonised approaches, and then this opens up a lot more of a rich and truly intercultural international way of working. And again, hopefully we're developing these toolkits now. It's still sort of rolling out. We haven't sort of got one way of doing it yet, but we've got academics and reading groups looking into this, and hopefully over the next few years we'll have sort of a more solid package, I guess, for decolonisation within Coil. And the other thing, particularly for us in research centres and looking at research around Coil, is this idea of the UN Sustainable Development Goals as well. We often find that working with international partners, having our teaching and learning outcomes anchored to the Sustainable Development Goals resonates a lot more and also becomes a lot more meaningful. But also as well, if people are seeking funding to do virtual exchange in Coil, usually if you're able to link them to the SDGs, that gives them a lot more emphasis and a lot more clout, I guess, to get funding on board, because funders are a lot more willing to say, well, actually, you are working towards that goal, that UN development goal, we're more likely to give you funding. It is really interesting actually working in research in Coil. Sometimes, certainly from funders, there's a real lack of understanding of what Coil is. So sometimes you can explain to them around SDGs and concepts of global citizenships. It makes it a little bit more real. It makes them understand a little bit better. But yes, if you ever go to a funder and just say, we do Coil, they're like, what does this mean? It's not always a truly understood sort of... Coil as a term is very focused on teaching and learning, so it's a well-known term within higher education, but perhaps it still isn't well-known in sort of the wider world out there. So yes, if you're ever talking about Coil to people wanting to fund you, explain it in such a way to do with just SDGs and global citizenship, because it helps people to understand a lot more. To summarise then, we did very much start off a few years ago as this bottom-up initiative from a very few core academics, which then grew to this realisation from our senior management that this was a worthwhile thing to invest in and a worthwhile thing to allow academics to do and to support academics to do. This was where we had a centralised offering then, so rather than being devolved and academics doing it individually, it then became sort of a more guided, centralised sort of offering to enable all students to engage with this. Although there's pros and cons around centralisation, however, through Coventry doing this, the centralised way of doing it, it did offer a more balanced way of ensuring training was offered to all of our academics, but also put a very strong emphasis on peer training. So those academic champions who were experienced with Coil, they were able to sort of impart their knowledge to their peers, and there was lots of peer sharing there. And again, once upon a time, Coil was very much, virtual exchange was very much seen as a prelude to mobility, but now I think it's very much seen as an equal activity in its own right. But there's always this sort of tension, I guess, as well. We're very bad in the UK for chasing metrics. We always want a good score, a good student satisfaction. And again, there's a little bit of a worry that sometimes that when we do Coil, it's seen as sort of almost a marketing activity to get students happy and to have tick boxes there. So again, there can be a balance between having a meaningful Coil, a meaningful, good education, very solid pedagogy, versus a light and fluffy Coil that makes the students happy. And again, it's working within the systems, it's playing the educational game, but it is interesting sometimes when senior management sees Coil and virtual exchange as a marketing opportunity, when actually in its own right it's a very good, solid educational activity as well. And one thing I haven't spoken too much around, but the universities always restructure. The pandemic was a very sort of difficult time for all educational areas, higher education in particular. So one thing that has happened recently is that Centre for Global Engagement that used to be a free of charge service to our university, there was a university office, it did get disbanded, and we've made now a private subsidiary company at Coventry where it's now seen as a bit of a capitalist money-making enterprise for the university. It's very early days yet, so this is a very new thing, but we're still learning and still seeing how this might impact Coil at Coventry. So there's now sort of a more money-focused mechanism where maybe they might start charging for teaching, for the training. They might be a little bit more outward-looking and charging for partners and whatnot there. It's an unknown quantity there, but this is sort of a bit of a system shock for everyone who is used to it being a sort of free-of-charge service for the university. At the moment, in reality, there's not been too much change. We still have many of the same staff supporting. It's just had a different name and a different sort of subsidiary status. But this could mean changes in the future. It is very much a wait and see. So the future, I've put a question mark there because we're always evolving as a university, and you know it could go either way. We do very well in terms of our reputation and our renown for Coil and virtual exchange. We have to change with the times. We have to keep on going, but the present is very difficult, and the post-COVID period is a challenge. So the future is a huge question mark there. And just very quickly then, this leads on to my research centre in our area within the university. So PLE is the Centre for Global Learning, Education and Attainment. And our research centre is actually quite an oddity because we were set up as purely academic. So at the time when we were set up in 2017, 2018, Centre for Global Engagement existed as a professional services centralised support for the university. Our research centre was created to try and help research around it because the research didn't take place at all within the Centre for Global Engagement. So our remit is very much to research around the global. We have a few research themes, but the one I'm in, the Education Without Boundaries, is very much focused on things like virtual exchange, Coil. I've got the pleasure of having PhD students such as Carlos working with me now as well. So there's a real growing and broad international body of research that we're undertaking. So I just want to spotlight one of the projects I've been working on recently, which is Kudu, which is very much focused on Coil. And Kudu is an ongoing project which is working with South African higher education institutions to internationalise Coil. There's 10 universities, so 5 from Europe, including the UK, 5 from South Africa. And this was really fascinating because this was, I guess, created the South African government changed its rules and mandates for higher education. And one of those mandates was all students had to be offered some kind of internationalisation experience within universities. So Coil was seen as one way of supporting that and a test bed, I guess, for South African institutions. And this was interesting because to begin with, some of the people on board were very on board with the idea of Coil, but as we often see, some people also are a little bit hesitant, saying, "Oh, can we do this? Are we able to do it?" So working with the South African institutions, many of the academics working with Coil were first-timers, so this was sort of very much working from a foundational level to capacity build and get people on board and trained up in Coil. The other real novelty and real joy of working with Kudu is that it was very much focused on this concept of decolonised Coil. So this wasn't us as Europeans saying, this is how we do Coil, this is how you must do Coil. We were sharing our concepts and sharing that, well, this is our experience with Coil, but we're working with the South African institutions to develop this idea of Africanised Coil and a very tailored Coil that works for those institutions. And this is where we started to see some of those caveats that we looked at with Coil. So we went in sort of very much saying, well, this is how the Europeans do it, but then we perhaps forgot around this concept around equity of access. So one of the things that did challenge us and we did have to work around was access to data, for example. So the way we charge for internet access is quite different in the UK to South Africa. And we quickly found out that certain times of the day for South Africans were more expensive to go online for, other times were less expensive. So we had to be very mindful around equity of access and how to get on board with these things. The other thing that we again were a little bit perhaps short-sighted, certainly from the UK, that they had this concept of load shedding where they shut off their electricity supply for certain periods of the day to reset the supply to make sure that everyone has equal access of electricity in South Africa. What that does mean is for short periods of the day there are blackouts, which means people can't use laptops, they can't use internet in the same way. So we had to work quite carefully there around, well, how do we make it fair and equitable for all to be involved and to be involved with this particular Coil. The other thing that perhaps certainly from me was unexpected and a little bit of challenge to get around was our South African colleagues, our South African learners. When we were starting to do the coils, the students were quite quiet to begin with. We couldn't figure out quite why students weren't willing or feeling able to talk to their European counterparts. And what we quickly found out was that there was a strange sort of perception that the European learners were somehow better than the South Africans. So the South Africans were a little bit scared almost to say they didn't want to speak up for fear of being sort of feeling foolish or feeling silly. So we had to work quite hard there to identify barriers and ways to break through there to make sure the South Africans felt confident enough to do that. And, you know, it's learning around those intercultural competencies and making sure that everyone feels valued. There's a lot of work around there about decolonization, equity and value. So that's something that we still have to put a little bit more of a stronger focus on there to say, you know, the European students are, you know, you're learning a degree, you're all at the same level, you are equal in that regard. So, you know, the platform is equal, and please do speak up. And again, this is something that we're trying to sort of figure out and just make sure that people do feel valued and you know, given that confidence to say, you know, you're equally valued and your opinion is equally valid here. But saying that, you know, Kudu has been highly successful. We've had a couple of years running now. We've had a number of pilots, quite a number of coils that have run, and the number of interested academics from both sides of Europe and South Africa has grown quite significantly. So I believe the very first coil pilot we had was just 2 sets of academics. We've now, I think, got 20, 30, 40 people wanting to be involved in getting through the training there. And because of the pandemic, we've also had permission from the European Union to carry on the project for another couple of years. So it's a really exciting project to be involved with, and hopefully I'll be able to share more in the future as the project evolves and carries on. But as I say, this is a really good, solid, if you go to the Kudu website, it's a really fascinating project to look at and sort of absorb what's going on, because that's an example of starting off with very few academics on their journey with Coil, and within 2 short years, such high numbers of people and academics and students wanting to be involved. The other project I'll just very quickly talk about is Jovital, which is the Jordan project, which Kyria mentioned earlier. And this is interesting because it's a real solid example of the need to tailor your approach to doing virtual exchange and doing Coil. So Jovital is very much around virtual exchange rather than specifically Coil. But Jovital was set up in reaction to, it's got very strict laws in Jordan around how much of a degree can be taught online. There's actually a governmental cap which says no more than 25% of any course can be online. So this represents a challenge for virtual exchange and for Coil. So in this case, we actually found Coil wasn't the most appropriate model. Having lots of students online and lots of students collaborating internationally didn't fit the teaching and learning environment in Jordan. So we actually found that virtual exchange in country was the better way of working, and very popular with the students. And what that taught us, certainly from Coventry, was that the traditional ways of our perceptions of working didn't suit the environment at all. Quite often for us at Coventry, we see Coil as sitting at a laptop, being plugged into the internet, being sat at a desk and operating internationally. What we found in Jordan was students didn't want to do that. They wanted to have WhatsApp. They were talking and collaborating on their phones in WhatsApp groups. And there was huge success with students coming together and getting so much collaborative work done locally via WhatsApp. And again, that really challenged our sort of perception of actually virtual exchange is so much bigger than Coil. And actually was a real solid sort of way of, a real reminder that there's no one way of doing things. You have to really sort of work and tailor things to that local environment. The Jovital project has now since come to an end, but we really hope to be able to take some of this research further in the future, just because it was such an intriguing challenge to our perception of what virtual exchange can and should be. And again, we've had Marina Jones join us as, I think, more or less full-timingly. And I just wanted to put some of her work out here, because, again, Kyria has worked very closely with Marina. It was actually Marina who was meant to be here today rather than myself, so I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be here. But I just want to draw some from a slide that Marina provided here about her research on the topic too, and her real insight into Coil, because, as I say, Marina is one of the key people from the grassroots level that helped Coil grow at Coventry. And Marina's argument is that the future of education is very much blended. We're probably post-COVID going to have this sort of concept of, yes, there'll still be teaching in the classroom, but there'll be much more virtual seeping in. And again, technology-enabled opportunities will very much seep into teaching and learning. And that's very important, not to say it's technology-led, because quite often sometimes when new technologies come in, we can jump on them and think this is amazing, but we shouldn't let the technology dictate what we can do. We should look at what's possible to use that technology. I think many years back we had a bit of an experiment with a virtual world called Second Life at Coventry, and that was a new piece of technology, and that was technology-led, and everyone was like, this is the future, everyone must learn in Second Life. And of course that never happened because it wasn't a natural interface for education there. So we actually had a virtual Coventry University campus on Second Life, which was popular for maybe a month or two, but because it was popular with the technology, but it hasn't really carried on. It's not stayed for years because that was an example of technology leading rather than technology enabled. And again, personalization of the learning journey. I think, again, that comes back to this concept of Coil has to be tailored, it has to be personalised. You can't just say, this is one way of doing things, and that's the only way of doing things. We have to work with our staff, our colleagues, our students, to make sure education is relevant. And again, this concept of equity, inclusivity and widening participation, we do have to find ways to make sure as many students as possible to get involved in this area and have the experience of internationalisation at home through this technology-enabled teaching and learning provision. Again, this concept of third spaces, decolonised third spaces. I really encourage people to read Marina's paper on this with my manager, Catherine. It's a little bit of a weird concept again to explain, but their paper puts it quite nicely. This idea around these intercultural spaces, these learning spaces that aren't in the classroom, where teaching and learning can take place, I guess, unofficially by students coming together. Again, having this in an online realm, this virtual realm, I think will be quite powerful, will be quite an interesting thing to research, but it's very much an under-researched area at the moment. And again, ultimately, the very purpose of doing Coil is this creation of geographically distant students coming together. I think there's enough evidence and research out there now to show that Coil is very, very good at doing this, and it's very helpful that we can get students together in a virtual space. Again, it is such a joy to be able to just jump online and have students talking together in real time. Sometimes it's challenging with time differences, but there's ways of there's ways of mitigating that. We don't always have to have it in real time. You can do Coil that's asynchronous, where it might be students responding to each other through videos that are pre-recorded. But there's so many different ways and so many different blends of being able to bring students together and to come together in this way. And I think about our supervision setup, even though we're 4 or 5 hours apart time distance, we can still come together virtually to have PhD supervisions. And that's a model of virtual exchange, a way of working, which I think is really quite exciting. So yeah, just coming to the end of my presentation now, to summarise, virtual exchange isn't a new thing. It has been talked about in literature for perhaps 30 years now. It's been around since the 1990s as computers have become more commonplace and the internet has become very widespread, in the home. And the methods and approaches for virtual exchange, for Coil, very much grew from the bottom up by these champions, by these academics from the late 1990s onwards. We then start to see UK institutions adopting Coil, adopting virtual exchange in the sort of late 2000s, 2010s. And this has come in very many different flavours, many different guises, very many different attempts to sort of brand things. Again, such a Coventry University to begin with, we were very, very keen and very, very determined to say OIL, Online International Learning, where the international standard is Coil, so we gave up on that one. We embraced the international standard on that one. And again, I think in the past, going back in many years, the gold standard, the desirability of internationalisation was always seen as mobility. With virtual exchange, with internationalisation at home perhaps being sort of secondary consideration. We then sort of came to a head with the pandemic of the last 2 years, which I believe and I think has been evidence that fundamentally challenged teaching and learning very much to its core. So very suddenly we had students and teachers having to operate online for the best part of 2 years. We couldn't come together like this. We couldn't have mass classrooms. Everything had to flip for the protection of learners and for educators. But what this has meant is we've had this very uneasy return to face-to-face. So at Coventry, we were very keen in March to say, right, we're moving back to the classroom. We have to get teaching and learning back to the classroom, and we see this across the world. I think there's been very much a very right, we're going back, which is a bit troubling because we learned so much over the pandemic. We learned how blended learning, online learning can have value. And I think this is where more research has to be undertaken to prove the worth, to prove the merit of it. Because if we can show management and show the leaders that there's evidence and research to suggest that this is important, hopefully then we can start to learn from the pandemic and really harness the benefits of virtualized learning and blended learning. UNESCO as well have said digital technology has changed how knowledge and information is assessed, shared and produced. The pandemic has significantly increased the digital transmission of knowledge, making digital competencies crucial for participation in society, including lifelong learning and employment opportunities. So I think there is a realization, again, from the UN and teaching and learning that things have to change or have to react to the pandemic. I just think at the moment we're in this uneasy period where people are wanting to get people on seats again, but we have to still learn how to integrate the online with the classroom, with the physical classroom. And again, this leads us to the future then. I think, again, from my perspective, and I think this very much aligns with what Marina's slide was saying earlier, we do have to work towards this idea of fair and equitable access to education, which I believe very much will incorporate technology. So rather than wanting students to be physically present or physically mobile, I think there probably is more space for virtual exchange and Coil, particularly for internationalisation at home. And again, there may be a stronger focus on blended learning, so students in the classroom with laptops or part classroom, part virtual. And I think there is an appetite for students as well to not always be in the classroom. Again, I think the pandemic has taught us that there is merits to the online learning. It's not perfect, and there still needs to be face-to-face interaction. However, teaching and learning can still take place virtually. And again, if we look at things like intercultural competencies, intercultural exchange, you're probably really only going to get that through the coming together of people in the virtual space. And again, I think as new technologies come around, we have to look at those. And again, it's how do we harness the technologies rather than be dictated by the technologies. One of the new things that's up and coming is this concept of virtual reality or virtualized learning spaces, which is really exciting. But again, we really have to think about how we're going to use them and how appropriate they are, rather than just saying everyone has a headset, learn on a headset. It is finding the best ways of doing that. And again, I keep finding in the literature references to this idea about sustainable digitalization, or this awkward word, digitainability, where it's about, the quote here, ensuring that future generations are able to continue to engage with technologies whilst closing that digital divide. And more importantly, students must be digitally literate as opposed to digitally reliant, whilst remaining cognizant of ethical issues that technology is appropriately used. And again, I think this is one of the challenges and balances we have to have at the moment, that people are increasingly reliant on technology, reliant on their phones, but sometimes this comes at the loss of some skills. So we have to make sure that people are still able to know the workings of technology and how to use technology, rather than just relying on AI or technology doing it for us. So again, it's just a silly example. Sometimes we have students coming to us saying, yeah, I know how to use the internet, I use TikTok, but when you ask them to do like a spreadsheet, for example, that's challenging for them because they haven't necessarily learned the intricacies of doing that. So we have to make sure that skills aren't lost through digitalization and through technology. It has to be sustainable. We have to make sure that the human element remains. We can't just expect technology to do everything for us. We have to work with it and operate with it. So yeah, just to conclude, hopefully I've not spoken for too long, but yeah, I very firmly believe that internationalisation at home is very important to teaching and learning, particularly at higher education. Although some people may disagree with this, I very much see virtual exchange, virtual learning as being this blanket umbrella term for a number of different approaches. People may refer to it in different ways, or perhaps even use Coil and V as an interchangeable tool. Some people might want to call it telecollaboration. But I think everyone's mostly talking around the same thing. It's the same concept, just different interpretations of it. And I actually think it's important to not get too hung up on it. Regardless of what it's called, we have to make sure that we're using it and using it appropriately. And as I say, collaborative online international learning, Coil, is one way of doing it, and it's one tool that's preferred at Coventry. And it's not something that can just, magically appear overnight. It has to grow, it has to evolve. It does have to have people on board and management on board too. But once it's there, it's a very sort of strong tool, and I think at Coventry it's here to stay. It's taken 5, maybe 10 years to get here, but it's very much embedded into everything we do at Coventry. And with this, we do have to make sure that it's tailored, and we have to make sure things are appropriate for all learners. And this is where decolonisation, third space, global really has to come into the consideration. We can't just sit and say, for Coventry, for example, this is the Coventry way of doing it, this is the Coventry Coil. We have to be, well, this is our experience of doing it. Please come in and please help tailor it and make it mutually beneficial to all. And again, mobility is one way of doing internationalisation, but I really don't see it as being the gold standard of doing it. I actually think there's quite a lot of limitations in mobility, which is why I place a lot of emphasis on internationalisation at home. And again, the realities that we live in with the 2020s, with what's happened since 2019, blended learning has to be a consideration. We have to make sure that students are willing and able, and teachers are willing and able to be involved. And we do find tutors and students that are very uncomfortable still sitting in a classroom, and we have to find ways of engaging with them. So it might be the case that teachers are in a classroom, we might have to have a camera to help support those students. But I don't think it's realistic to expect everyone at the moment to be willing or comfortable coming into a classroom still, even though sort of, the pandemic is officially, in inverted commas, over. There's a very long tail on it. There's still a lot of fear about it. We still have to be very careful and vigilant around things like COVID. We've seen more recently, there's a few other sort of viruses and things that are coming into the mainstream. We have to be cognizant of global pandemics and mitigating those and making sure people feel safe and comfortable. And again, finally, we have to evolve as academics, we have to evolve as learners as well. We can't just be statics. We do have to consider that technology will change. One of the fascinating things, again, about that paper that was written in 2016, I think, lots of the tools, lots of the web apps that they refer to within that paper, we've already replaced at Coventry. So the Open Moodle standard that was referred to in the paper, we've already sort of abandoned that and moved on to different ways of working with Microsoft Teams. That does pose a challenge in terms of training, keeping up with technologies, but equally we do have to follow those trends to make sure that what we're delivering and how we're using the online space is appropriate and still is fit for purpose. So again, Coil is an exciting journey because we're always having to learn something new and grappling with new technologies and ways of working. But equally, it's very important not just to stand still and be static, because if you look at how we did Coil 10 years ago, for example, things have changed so much in society, technologies change. Looking at how we did it back then just wouldn't be appropriate, or maybe not even acceptable today. So it is always a roller coaster ride of keeping up with trends and new ways of working. So to answer the question that Kyria posed at the start, what is the potential of Coil or virtual exchange? I would say it's pretty much almost limitless. There's so much you can do with it because it's such a flexible tool. There is a caveat there, however, that we do need to keep adapting. We can't just remain static. But as I say, I think there's a huge opportunity, ongoing opportunity for that virtual space, not least for internationalisation at home, but for teaching and learning in general. And I'll leave it there, thank you. Very much open to questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. I'd like to invite, Carlos, can you just help me before you sit here? Maybe we can move the computer so we can all, can they see? Yeah.
Let's bring the questions.
Huh? Just a second. I can't see here. Okay. Do you think you can put the first slide is...
Sorry.
I hope everyone can see us and can see Carlos as well. I've asked Carlos to join us here at the table so that he can help us with the questions in the chat, in the YouTube. And I'd like to tell the audience that if anyone wants to make a question or comment, and if you prefer not to do it in English, you can do it in other languages. We'll try to the best of our capacity to translate and mediate. And just so that you know, Alan, so thank you very much for your talk. It was very nice, to see the potential and ways in which we have to engage. And as you were talking, I was sort of trying to relate to our experience here at UFIS and with our attempts to engage with Coil. And I remember a talk that I had with our head of the international office, who's present here, Yuri and Felipe, some time ago, talking about the challenges of implementing online activities, courses, and virtual exchange right after the pandemic. And I remember, and please correct me, Yuri, if I'm not wrong, that Yuri said, you know, this is very difficult to do in this moment when we return to in-person classes, because a lot of people are having this feeling of hangover with online. So just the mention of doing anything online for a lot of people is like, please, after 2 years, we just want to go back to in-person and traditional forms of meetings. But I hope, Alan, that after this hangover period that we're all facing, and I'm not sure whether this is also going on in Coventry, perhaps that we can find ways, like you said, of keeping adapting to this, because there's only one thing for sure, that we cannot stop adapting and moving with what is happening. And so I just wanted to mention this and ask you, while Carlos is looking at the questions, I don't know if there's anything new.
I would just congratulate you.
Thank you.
That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember one question, I think it was Jen, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it right, Jen, in the chat, so if I'm not, please correct me. Jen mentioned that he was sort of confused about the use of the umbrella term virtual exchange to refer to other activities that did not involve exchange of students, such as MOOCs, etc. And then Marina, in the chat, she was able to interact and say that in some of the Coil approaches, in some of the courses that we've done, you know, with you, with Carlos and other colleagues from Coventry and UFIS, we've embedded MOOCs into the Coil. And so we are doing different forms of blends. And like Alan mentioned in the Kudu, I think, project with the WhatsApp. And
JavaScript, yes.
Yeah, in many circumstances, be it because of the access to technology or because of other limitations, we have to use other forms of access, and not all of them are synchronous. So I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, two things. I mean, the first comment's really interesting because there's a very ingrained perception of what teaching and learning is, and what the issue we have in the UK. Students have to pay for their education. It's quite expensive. Successive governments have very much put up the cost of learning. What that means, however, is when students are faced with something like Coil, there's not a teacher at the front of the classroom, it's not a traditional setup, so quite often they're like, well, we're paying for a degree, we're paying for education, this isn't education. So it can be quite difficult sometimes to get people's mindsets changed around that. As I say, it's usually only afterwards, or after they've experienced the Coil or the international activity, that they think, oh, actually that was really good, this is a really good, solid educational experience. Sometimes for teachers as well, because it's a very different way of working. I mean, teachers are very, very much involved in Coil, even though the focus is on student-to-student interaction. It's very highly structured with the teachers sort of there in the background guiding and whatnot. But as I say, for both teaching staff and for students, it can be quite difficult cognitively to understand that this is still a valid teaching and method of teaching and learning. But yeah, we're so used to this idea of having a classroom, having an expert at the front. I think that will take a long time just for people to understand that there are different ways of doing things. And I think perhaps this is one of the challenges with decolonisation. This concept of a tutor at the front is very, it has a very long history, certainly from the European tradition. It perhaps just will take a very long time to unpick and to challenge. But with the umbrella term thing, this is something that's I think it's important not to get too caught up on the technicalities of the language you use. I think when we say virtual exchange, I think that infers something online and something where there's an exchange of knowledge or teaching and learning. Coil, I find, is a very precise term. As I say, I think is a tool, and that's why I like the acronym. It says exactly what you need. It's collaborative, it's online, it's international, it's learning. It does get fuzzy with some of the other ones. I can understand the critique, for example, of a MOOC. But, you know, even on the MOOC, there's still a transfer of knowledge taking place. So although it's perhaps not as tutor-led, someone still has had to create the content, someone's had to put it online for the students to learn. So it's still virtual in the fact it's in an online space. There's still a transfer of knowledge, even though it's the students gleaning it from written text. But as I say, I see that, that's why I say it's an umbrella. It's a very sort of generalized term. But then it's useful to have the discussion about, well, what do you want to get out of it? Well, what tools do you want to use? That's why I'm very hesitant to say Coil is the same as virtual exchange. Coil is one way of doing virtual exchange. But as I say, I see virtual exchange, that very high level descriptor of what's happening. And funny enough, my own PhD, I was looking at peace education, and I found exactly the same thing. The term peace education is this huge umbrella of hundreds of activities, but when you get to talk to the practitioners of it, you then get into the real insights of what it is and what you mean. But it's about being open, I think. I mean, it's looking at what's on offer, looking at the benefits of what's there, and then ultimately making sure the education experience, the pedagogical experience is solid.
Thank you. I completely agree. And as I said in the beginning, Alan, I think it's so important that we find ways to incorporate this sort of knowledge into what we do in universities, not only thinking about the SDGs, but about the actual world context in which we are living. Alan was just mentioning to me before, when we were driving to office today, that he, at Coventry, he would teach in the international relations course. And I mentioned to him that though we don't have the international relations course at office, we have a nucleus. Felipe is here. He's one of the coordinators of the Center for International Relations, which aims in a way to sort of reflect and discuss the geopolitics and context in which we are living, and how can we guarantee and perhaps promote more peace. And that is why I think what you're doing and being able to include peace education through all the curriculum, be it with Coil or other approaches, is something very needed. I don't know if there are any comments in the chat, and if anyone here in the audience would like to make a comment or a question, please. Can I ask somebody to give, we have here Professor Zezé, right? Maria José Pontes from the International.
My question is a really powerful method, if I say this, but you mentioned about physics and other subjects, but for engineering, for example, when we have a laboratory, or how to manage this?
Yeah, I mean, this is really interesting. So it's about tailoring and about looking to see what's appropriate. So Coil will never replace the physical classroom. There's still foundational knowledge that students must be taught. Where we've worked with engineers and people who develop physical products, where we find success with Coil is that we ask them to maybe do the design element or come up with sort of a concept that can be done online, and then the students can then take their learning and their exchange back to the classroom. So I just trying to think of examples that we've had where there might be sort of a concept for a circuit or something within mechanical engineering or electronical engineering. So the students might have the task to talk about that online, and that the online task, the online assessment could just be around the design alone, but then the students might then take that into their own classroom and then work on that. So as I say, Coil is like a component, I guess, of that teaching and learning. And again, it can vary hugely from subject to subject. I think about the healthcare one. One of the things that perhaps I didn't talk about in detail, one of the Kudu Coil exchanges was very much multi-interdisciplinary. So we had healthcare students in the UK, and it was looking at, I think it was food safety. So they were looking at sort of the biology and the safety element of food. But in South Africa, it was logistics students. So the logistics students were explaining how fresh fruits, fresh vegetables were being prepared and picked for international export. But then the UK students were then looking at it from the biological health safety point of view. So the task then was to come up with some kind of solution to make sure the food safety was there from the transport to the consumption. So it's thinking perhaps a little bit abstract around how you can do it, but there's some fascinating ways of coming together. And again, it's a topic in its own right, but the coming together of different subject areas is hugely beneficial. So it's a little bit challenging sometimes to get that set up because lots of people are quite hesitant and scared to do that. But when you come together to link things in that way, it becomes very real for the students, because then that's sort of like a real life workplace dilemma. If you were to work in global agriculture, you would have to think about logistics, then think about the safety. So it gives them a little insight then into like a small activity to think about it, to then sort of take that to their subject area.
Yeah, and also like you mentioned, Alan, virtual reality, which we know it's one way in which, especially disciplines such as physics, engineering, that are very practical oriented. We've launched it here at UFIS. I think I mentioned this briefly to you, Alan, a project about the potential of virtual reality to teach practical courses. In my case, you know, the English teaching practicum course, which is, you know, in classes, it's very practical. And we've had a lot of difficulties and challenges on that, not least the financial one. The financial support we got from Papis Universal, for example, enabled us to get one headset of Oculus. So how do you do that? How do you do a project in a class, for example, with engineers? How many students do you have? I don't know. In our classes are like 26, more or less the same number. So how do we do that? Our partners in University of Valencia in Spain, for example, they were able to have headsets to everyone, but we were not. So how do we join in, you know, with these challenges and difficulties? They've managed to buy the very cheap ones that cost about I think €5, the cardboard.
Oh, yeah.
So they're using that. And this is a possibility, although we cannot do everything with the cardboard glasses as we can do with the goggles. But I would say embedding virtual reality together with MOOCs and other is one solution for these very practical courses.
And one thing I will say as well, again, just to use Kudu as the example, again, we are aware that the windows of time where students can realistically talk together to make it feasible is fairly short. So often what happens is that a task is set, the discussion will take place online, but then they'll come back to their localized areas and then present back. Another one, I believe, was in the Kudu Coil project. I think it was. So it was town planning in South Africa and disaster management in the UK. And I think it was looking at the pandemic and some of the rules and regulations in place in that town in South Africa. So the project was critiquing the town planning and what could be done better to improve and react to pandemics or disasters. So we had the UK disaster management students looking at it from a theoretical point of view, the South African students looking at it from their town planning point of view, and the activity was then the exchange of knowledge, talking together to then take back to their localized classrooms. And again, I think what you were saying, Kiri, is it's very important not to let the technology dominate. We must find the ways to work with it. So if there's only one laptop for 40 students, take the activity offline, then have that discussion in the online space. And it could be the case that, you know, the interaction could be a symposium or a presentation, but it's important that students come together to talk, but different elements of the activity could be separate. And it's just about working with the technology that's available, and as I say, seeing what's feasible. And again, we often get worries given to us from class sizes. So again, we're quite fortunate in Coventry to be able to have sometimes even a laptop per student. In other countries, sometimes it might be very large classrooms, very small amounts of technology. So it's then about looking at what will work, can we group them together?
What is available?
In a certain way. So again, it's adapting to what's available without letting the technology dictate.
Right, yes. But thank you for your comments. Yes, Yuri, can somebody pass him the... Thank you.
So I have a question regarding the language barrier. And so you mentioned that students, you know, the top-down mandate on internationalization as part of the mission.
Yes.
Do you require your students to have a second language? That's one question. And the second question related to that, because I'm not familiar with the UK as a whole, but in my experience in the United States, for example, unless you're from a family of immigrants, you only speak English. Okay? I wonder if that's the same for the UK as well. I mean, if you require students to understand.
Yes, so yes, that's the case. So that broadly speaking, when students come, certainly from overseas, there's a qualification that is IELTS, I think, that they do to be able to. So it's not a high barrier, but there has to be a certain level to be able to manage with teaching and learning. It can cause tension sometimes because sometimes our students have English as third, fourth language, not even second language. And again, within Coil, it's a very high barrier sometimes to expect people to be able to engage in English if it is second, third, fourth language. But we do our best. I mean, as I say, we at Coventry have a Centre for Academic Writing and Language Support. We also offer summer schools for English language learning to our students as well. But as I say, if you're a UK student who have done UK qualifications, the expectation is that because you've done the UK qualifications, you've got that level. As I say, it can pose challenges, but it's we've never had extreme problems. And again, some of our PhD students that come to us at Coventry, they've done all their education abroad. They've come to us to do a PhD. Sometimes we might ask them to do a summer school refresher. I've got one student in particular from Malaysia who's looking at the use of English as an internationalized language for Islamic studies, for example, and they were very worried around the use of English language, and it was a real fear for that student, whereas actually a year in, she's doing fantastically. So I think it's very much helping the students who feel confident and overcome those fears. The understanding from the academic side that it's not going to be perfect, and that's okay as long as it's understandable and we can help them through the process. Within Coil, however, sometimes we have to be very careful with how we teach intercultural competencies. So our students in particular can be impatient. So if they're feeling that the other students aren't able to communicate, but then it's saying, well, actually, this is the whole part of the intercultural communication, is working and understanding that you're going to have to maybe slow it down and take that time to learn from the other. But yeah, the support mechanisms are in place. But say, in summary, the blanket policy that if you're an overseas student from a non-English language country, you do have to have a qualification to show that you've got English competency. But broadly speaking, it's about having that realization and understanding that you have to come to a compromise, work collaboratively, work as part of that intercultural spirit. And yeah, as I say, we've had some very unusual coils with people from very different backgrounds, very different languages, but that's part of the experience, is having that ice-breaking and intercultural competencies. And it can mean sometimes students can't talk to each other to begin with, but we do find ways of doing that. And sometimes we even encourage our students, our partner students, to do something in their native language, so we can expose them to the English speakers to at least hear and try to understand that language. Because again, we're so blinkered in the UK that everything is in English. It is very important to expose our students to that. And again, we do encourage within Coils to get the other students to say, oh, please just say something in your native language. And the other thing that I'm experiencing more and more so is when we have our overseas PhD students, quite often there's terminology which doesn't translate to English at all. So there's a term or something they want to say, and they say to us, I can't find the word, there's no one word in English. So what we try to really encourage is put it in your native language and then try to explain what that term means, even if it takes 2, 3, 4 sentences in English. But I think it's very important, again, from that decolonization lens, to make sure that their intention of what they're saying is truly understood, and if that means using their own language or a foreign word, put it in, and make us as English language readers understand, and force us to learn a little bit more.
Thank you. We're running out of time, but we still have time for maybe one more question from the audience, Professor Tanya, and maybe one more from the chat.
Wagner was here, and he is our coordinator here in education program, graduate program, and he would like to ask you about your experience in graduate programs.
Sure. So in terms of just sort of generally, so our research centre is really quite unique. we were set up as a pure research centre, and at the moment we don't actually have any undergraduate or postgraduate taught programmes in our centre. It's only PhD students. We're trying to develop our own educational masters as part of that, trying to then sort of incorporate very much globalised learning. One of our PhD student strands is the PhD in global education. So it is interesting. So for the majority of Coventry University, there, all the teaching and learning is per subject in the faculties, in the schools. So when I did teach in international relations, that was in the School of Humanities. So that's one of the challenges of embedding Coil and virtual exchange. I think that traditional model of faculties, departments, and all those, the graduate programs, undergraduate programs, postgraduate programs, they're all created from that subject area, and then this gets added on. So what we're hoping to try and do with our own masters in education, our own graduate programs in education, we're trying to make sure this is embedded. So yes, the subject area is education, but we really want to try and make sure all these sort of skills and intercultural elements are put in there. But I think also this is why it took such a long, relatively speaking, a long time for virtual exchange to be embedded, because again, the tradition at Coventry was hundreds upon hundreds of courses, all doing their own subject level learning, and all of a sudden, top down, they were told, you've got to do Coil now. So understandably, there was a bit of a backlash, a bit of a reticence to do that to begin with, because people don't like being told what to do. And, people are, you're a subject expert. If you're a teacher, you'll be teaching in that. It can be hurtful to be told you need to do something else. So yeah, it is working collaboratively and making sure that people understand the benefits of why we're saying, have you considered doing a Coil? But yeah, one thing we don't have is any sort of, I'm not aware of any way of any programs that are purely devoted to virtual exchange. I've never heard of a degree in virtual exchange or a master's in virtual exchange. So that could be interesting to, if there's an appetite for it, there might well be a whole graduate program for this. But for us at the moment, it's our PhD students are taking the lead at looking at virtual exchange. And yeah, we've got Carlos here specifically looking at Coil as well. But yeah, as I say, it's the PhD student body that's very much leading the way with this research at the moment.
So thank you very much, Alan. Since we're running out of time, I'd like to thank the audience here, the audience online. I would like to say if you have any more questions or comments, maybe you can wait 1 or 2 more years for Carlos to return from Coventry as an expert in Coil. And of course, we hope that he'll make a very fruitful contribution not only to UFIS and the Coil courses we've been able to do and will do in the future with Carlos' expertise, but also for Brazil in general with his PhD dissertation. So I'd like to thank everyone very much. Professor Marina, who's not here, but not here physically, but of course it's here in spirit with us. And Alan, I don't know if you have any other questions, comments?
Well, no, just to say a huge thank you. As I say, I still consider myself early in career, so it's such a privilege to be able to come here, and it is so nice to be able to travel again and see people, and yes, just be able to have the conversation with like-minded people. And yeah, it's just thank you so much for having me here. I hope I can do a little bit more with UFES in the future. But what I will say as well, if people do want to contact me, there are my Twitter and email address, and I'll send Twitter and email address. If you've got any more specific questions, or even maybe want to be involved in Coil, I'll try my best to help with that. If I can't help, I probably know people who can at Coventry. But yeah, they say Coventry is a very international focused university, so we're always looking for opportunities, partnerships, Coil research. So please do get in contact if you'd like to have that conversation. But thank you again.
Thank you. Is it transmission? Yes, please. I would like to ask Professor Tanya, Professor Yuri